Identity, Personal and Social by Vivian L. Vignoles. Identity, Personal and Social, Vivian L. Vignoles, University of Sussex, UK. Identity refers to how people answer the questions, who are you? This question may be posed explicitly or implicitly at a personal or collective level to others or to oneself. School of thought within the identity literature tend to emphasize either personal or social contents and either personal or social processes. However, I argue here that identities are inescapably both personal and social in their content and in the process by which they are formed, maintained, and changed over time. The personal and social nature of identity gives the construct its greatest theoretical potential, namely to provide insights into the relationship between the individual and society. However, doing justice to this potential requires integrating perspectives on identity and self processes from social and personality psychology, developmental psychology, cultural, critical, and discursive psychology, and beyond. In this chapter, I outlined some key parameters for such an integrative understanding of identity. I examined the extensive and interconnected nature of identity content and then considered the confluence of sociocultural, relational, and individual processes by which identities are formed, maintained, and changed over time. Introduction. The question, who are you, is one of the most important questions that most people will ever face. We can ask if of ourselves and of others. We can face it individuals or and as members of social groups or categories. Sometimes we might consider explicitly, who are you? Who am I? Who are we? More pervasively, however, the question is involved implicitly in a wide range of psychological and social processes. The choices we make, goals we pursue, or emotional experiences, relationships with others, friendly or hostile treatment of different groups of people, and thus ultimately our own and others' psychological and physical well-being. The study of identity is at the heart of the study of how individuals and groups answer the who are you question, the explicit and implicit meanings of their answers, identity content, the psychological and social processes involved in reaching, maintaining, and sometimes revising their answers, and the identity processes and the personal and social consequences of these contents and processes. Given the breadth of the topic thus defined, perhaps it is surprising that theorizing and research into identity extends well beyond the confines of personality and social psychology. Identity has been a major focus for numerous disciplines, including philosophy, 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 sociology, anthropology, political theory, gender studies, and psychoanalysis, as well as across social, personality, developmental, discursive, and cross cultural fields of contemporary psychology. Conceptualization of identity vary greatly within and across disciplines, so that the concept of identity often seems difficult to pin down. Identity has been defined as unitary or multiple, real or constructed, stable or fluid, personal or social, and in many other ways that often seems to contradict each other. Hence, some authors have proposed that any attempt at integration will be counterproductive, or even that the term identity may be too broad to be meaningful. Against these views, I believe that it is by looking at these seeming contradictions that some of the most interesting and potentially important questions about identity come to the fore. How can identities be experienced as a unitary, stable, and real if they are also multiple, fluid, and constructed, and what would it mean to conceptualize identities as simultaneously personal and social? The latter question is the main focus of this chapter. The personal social dichotomy. One of the first things a psychologist student might learn about identity is that personal or individual and social or group identities should be distinguished. This seems intuitively appealing since an individual is evidently not the same thing as a group, and it also resonates with a broader tendency in Western thought to consider individuality and sociality as opposing forces. For critics, see Ginsberg. Yet, on closer inspection, the conceptual distinction between personal and social identity becomes less clear. In what sense is personal identity personal and not social? And in what sense is social identity social and not personal? One intuitive answer is that personal and social identity refer to different classes of identity content. Famously defines social identity as that part of an individual's self-concept which derives from his knowledge of his membership of social group or groups, together with the value and emotional significance attached to that membership. By implication, although not stated in Taffel's definition, personal identity may be what is left over from this, those parts of the self-concept that are derived from individuals' knowledge of other kinds of self-attributes. In this view, then personal and social identity are different subsets of identity content. However, as I discuss later, research and theorizing within the social identity tradition make distinguishing between personal and social identity in terms of content rather problematic. Similarly, it is only people's interpretation of a given aspect of identity content as social personal make it is so, and this may be also be highly variable across contexts. In the right circumstances, even characteristics as similarly personal as one's preference between paintings by two quite similar artists can become as a basis for social identification and intergroup relations. Thus, however intuitive it may seem, classifying certain identity aspects as personal and others as social does not seem tenable. Alternatively, one might argue that for a distinction between personal and social identity, in this view, social identity is social not because of its content, but because it is understood to be located in social interactions and cultural discourse that happened between people, rather than within the intrapsychic processes of each separate individual. However, I will argue that it's precisely the confluence of processes at these different levels that gives identity dynamics their importance. Much of the classic theorizing on social identity involves intrapsychic processes, and much research and theory attests to the importance of interpersonal as well as cultural processes in the genesis of people's personal self-conceptions. Thus, intrapsychic processes, social interactions, and wider social cultural processes are involved in identity constructions and maintenance. And focusing on any of these levels in isolation leads to a reductionist and impoverished view of what matters about identity. In what follows, I consider the implications of viewing identities as inescapably both personal and social, not only in their content, but also in the processes by which they are formed, maintained, and changed over time. Although different schools of thought within the identity literature tend to emphasize either personal or social contents, however, defined in either personal or social processes, I will argue that it's precisely the both personal and social nature of the identity that gives the construct its greatest theoretical potential to provide insights into the relationship between the individual and society. An integrative perspective doing justice to this complexity could speak to research and theorists across the social sciences. Identity content. Researchers generally agreed that the contents of identity are broad and multifaceted, extending well beyond the limits of the physical body of an individual. An early statement of this position was William James' definition of what he called the me. In its widest possible sense, a man's me is the sum total of all that he can call his, not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his house and his wife and his children, his ancestors and friends, his reputation and works, his lands and horses and yacht and bank account. All these things give him the same emotion. If they wax and prosper, he feels triumphant. If they dwindle and die away, he feels cast down, not necessarily in the same degree for each thing, but in much the same way for all. The psychological process described here might now be termed identification. Much research has now explored how people identify themselves, not only with their individual physical and psychological characteristics, but also with significant others, groups or social categories, material objects and places, resulting in the concept of an extended self. The extended self, personal as well as social. Below, I review research illustrating how people may identify with significant others, groups or social categories, material objects and places. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list nor a categorical system, but rather to illustrate the breadth of what can be considered as identity content. All of these aspects can be considered as attributes of an extended self, in that they extend beyond the physical body and psychological characteristics of the individual. However, what gives them their psychological importance is that people identify with them personally, experiencing them as part of the self, or part of their answers to the question, "Who are you?" Thus far from being separate from personal identity, it is precisely because they are closely associated or even cognitively interchangeable. With one's sense of personal identity, that such aspects of extended self matter so greatly. Relational identification. The idea that significant others can be experienced as part of the self has been extensively investigated by Aaron and colleagues. Aaron Tudor Nelson reported a series of experiments showing that close others were treated as interchangeable with the self when allocating resources and in memory of reaction time tasks. Moreover, the extent of self-other overlap in romantic relationships was strongly associated with feelings of closeness and love, and it predicated relationship maintenance after 3 months. A pictorial measure of self-other overlap, the inclusion of other in the self-IOS scale, is now widely used in personal relationships research. While the IOS perspective focuses on specific relationships, another line of research has examined individual differences in the tendency to view close relationships in general as important and self-defining. Cross, Bacon, and Morris developed the relational interdependent self-control scale to measure these